This is WZRD Chicago 88.3 FM. Today we have three members of Refuse Fascism with us at WZRD. Could everybody please introduce yourselves, and then after the introductions, please tell us what Refuse Fascism is all about.
My name's Downey.
Dave Ciba.
I'm Tran.
Okay, so I go ahead and describe Refuse Fascism for us.
Refuse Fascism, and thanks ZRD for having us, because this is a really important time right now. Refuse Fascism began after Trump's election with people recognizing that what we were facing was something very, very dangerous. And we called it fascism. Not an exaggeration, not a curse word. And if you think of what's happened in the last 2.5 years, it points to what fascism is and why this is a threat to humanity. Think about the concentration camps on the border. Think about, before the eyes of the world, migrant children being tormented and tortured in those camps. Think about what happened in El Paso and Gilroy and other places, unleashing white supremacist terror, targeting immigrants and Latinos. Women's right to abortion is on the way to being banned, not only all the bans on a state level, but just in the last couple of weeks, defunding Planned Parenthood if it says anything about women's right to abortion, give people the medical advice they need. Meanwhile, Trump is filling up the courts, including the Supreme Court, with fascist judges, throwing gasoline on the fires of environmental catastrophe. There's a steady drumbeat of not only terrorizing whole groups of people in society, but locking into place a fascist regime, a new order. And there is, we have a strategy. Think Puerto Rico, think Hong Kong. People starting in their hundreds, then thousands, then millions, going in the streets in sustained mass resistance around the demand Trump and Pence must go. That is what is needed. The Democratic Party has been conciliating with fascism, with the Trump-Pence regime. They went along and put $4 billion for the border wall and further terror on the border. They refused to seriously go after impeachment, but are playing a waiting game while the clock runs out.
Are you saying that the Republican Party do not care who is in the office of the president, as long as it is the Republican Party?
Trump the Republican Party itself is now largely fascist, and that's the key thing. Is that
how did it change over?
Well, that's a good question, and it goes back some decades. But so maybe Dave, you really want to speak. But there's two things. One is it goes back. There's deep roots to it, but there's also an abrupt, very violent, and dangerous change that's gone on with the ascension to power of Trump and Mike Pence, who represents a ugly Christian fundamentalism fascism.
I mean, fascism of the Republican Party, I mean, I don't know if I'd call like Eisenhower a fascist, but let's just say where it kind of started was, in a sense, maybe not someone was rooted to Richard Nixon, especially when he fired his attorney general, when he was being investigated. And there is also the course of Christian fascism. Christian fascism, in a sense where pretty much goes back to before Trump and Pence, of course. And I think Mike Pence, the vice president, represents the Christian fascist sense of the Trump-Pence regime in the White House. I know when Roe versus Wade became rule of law and abortion became legal, they were working their hardest to reverse Roe versus Wade, and they're very persistent on it. And now it came to a point where, like, we have, I don't know, between 8 to 10 abortion cases in the Supreme Court. Now we have enough Supreme Court justices to reverse pretty much abortion rights, 45 years, women's rights to choose 45 years. And Trump even said when he was running for president that will be overturned. I will put enough judges to overturn that. And you see, and at that point, so that's the whole thing of Christian fascism. And a lot of the fascist elements, so this, how do I say this? I know when Reagan ran for office as well, he appealed to some level of those elements in the South as well. That's why he pretty much announced his presidential candidacy in was it Philadelphia, Mississippi, where it was famous for a certain lynching. You know, like there was a reason the Republican Party always appealed to that group of people, but now they're kind of slowly becoming that. You know, and there's a conflict in that party, or one of the ruling classes in general, where you know they want to keep what we have now, but then the other half of everybody wants to run through fascist rule. But now it's become mostly all fascist. In a sense, when we say fascist, it's like Lou said, I'm not name calling like some punk rock star, you're a fascist, F you. It's more the sense of where the executive branch is pretty much either ignoring the judicial branch, not giving the kids back to their parents, or ripped from, you know, like the migrant kids are ripped from their parents, the executive branch not listening to judicial orders, or stuffing the judicial branch full of fascist judges with a certain right-wing Christian fascist agenda, and basically demonizing certain groups of people, like ethnic and religious groups, demonizing journalists in a sense where you don't trust where media comes from, white victimhood, where basically you feel your status of a higher privilege feels threatened, and you pretty much feed off that fear. Those are a lot of elements that lead into fascism, basically. So.
I mean, just to emphasize the point that David was making about what's so different, moving in the direction of the rule, moving in the direction of rule by open terror from the streets, these fascist mobs that are being galvanized, but also eviscerating basic rights and tearing apart the rule of law. Here's a question we'd like to pose to all of you listening out there. If you're not out in the streets now to stop Trump and Pence, what will you do if Trump wins the election in 2020, either by the popular vote or by the Electoral College? And what will you do if Trump refuses to accept the results of the election if he doesn't win?
I read that your aim is to gather 1 million people who are going to help you in your goals to remove Pence and Trump from the White House. How close are you to the goal now? Or have you surpassed 1 million people?
Sadly, we did not surpass 1 million people, and that's kind of a struggle we've been having with working with fascism. Is the fact that it's. I mean, like our goal is to do, like Lou said, what he did in Puerto Rico recently, and Hong Kong, and also within South Korea a few years ago as well. It's challenging, but it's also worth it, because let's just say if we do a fascism consolidate, it's going to be a really big nightmare. And me personally, like I would like to pretty much go down fighting before I let that consolidate myself and be really persistent on it. So
how did all of you come to work with Refuse Fascism, and if how you came to work with it, with the group worked for you, all three of you, then is Refuse Fascism applying the same methods to recruiting others as they recruited you?
Well, I got involved right after the 2018 midterm, around that time, and I got involved via a protest that was run by a different group of people, and that was how I found out who Refuse Fascism was. They gave me a flyer, and they had another protest scheduled for that weekend, so I went to it because I was curious. I wanted to know. I felt that this was, not the way things needed to be, so I went back that next day, and I just kept going, and I like to think we're doing a good job of recruiting people that same way. I mean, I've been to a lot of protests since then, and Refuse Fascism is almost always out there, trying to get the word out about who they are and what they do and why they want to do it. So I think we're doing a decent job, at least as far as that goes, and getting the word out to people.
The group that introduced you to Refuse Fascism, is Refuse Fascism still working with that group?
I really couldn't tell you the answer to that, to be totally honest. I think it was more of Refuse Fascism was also at that particular protest, as opposed to something that the two groups worked together on.
Just to, I think to make this clear, people right now in large numbers are not where they need to be in order to have a serious shot at stopping this. And that's part of all the normalization that's gone on. Think of Northeastern Illinois University, along with the Democratic Party strategist down in Brazil, and Chicago tonight, hosting Sean Spicer, that vicious liar that announced the Muslim ban and the beginning steps of the Trump fascist regime, and treating him with legitimacy. That is part of what's normalizing this. And so we are going out to people to bring forward their determination and their braver side. We know there's fear, and there's reason to be fear. But think about it. What we have to have more fear of is what this is going to mean for the world, not just for immigrant people, black people, women, LGBTQ people, and their only recently won rights, but all of humanity. That's.
Do you have a lot of black people, LGBTQ people in Refuse Fascism working with you?
There's people from all those that are part of it. It is not a large organization. That's part of where I'm posing where we're at and why we see that it's so decisive today to challenge people who are relying and waiting. It is immoral right now to wait till 2020. Not only so much damage will be done, but go back to the earlier question, there's no guarantee that this regime would even leave. They're riling people up to basically declare they have a right to be here and stay here. So that's what we're trying to pose to people in terms of what their moral responsibility to get out of their comfort zone and join together, put aside differences in the one thing that everyone who wants anything that's positive in this world, we have to go through and stop this Trump-Pence regime before all these nightmares get doubled down, but also this social order gets locked into place. You can vote fascists into power. That's happened before historically. You can't vote them out. It has to be driven out by the power of the people.
So you're saying that voting them out is not that if they are voted out, there are other tools that they could remain in power. So voting them out does not work. Do you find some discrepancy in the way the U.S. government is set up as after an election happens?
Well, when it comes to discrepancies after an election, I mean, the 2000 election with Bush and Gore shows how illegitimate that is, that the Electoral College went against the voting majority. And then you got Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton. And in the cases, and the stakes were even higher with Trump, actually, because he is a straight-up fascist, more so than Bush ever was. So the stakes of the Electoral College is illegitimate. The American electoral process pretty much is illegitimate. The fact that we do have an Electoral College that goes against the majority, that in itself. Now, it's kind of a fine line about when it comes to the debate about voting, because one thing I try not to do is debate voting in itself. I have my criticism of it, but at the same time, the whole point of Refuse Fascism and its cause is not to debate voting in itself. We have people in Refuse Fascism that do vote. We have people in Refuse Fascism that basically don't vote. We have, but what we're united in is what we recognize fascist consolidation coming from the White House and democratic norms that were used to getting crushed slowly. We unite on that.
Let me just pose a simple question out there to all you folks. Are you ready to gamble by waiting and relying on the same political process through which Trump and this fascist regime came to power, to gamble the world on waiting for that to work to stop this nightmare, even as it's being furthered and consolidated? Think about that.
How do you propose to stop this, the Pence and Trump regime without voting? Is there a way that you could get them out of the White House? What do you propose besides protests?
Well, what we're proposing is a massive street movement that has worked historically. The Refuse Fascism strategy is a strategy that has been proven to work. And I'm not like fantasizing about some mass movement. No, this has worked historically in the past with the Civil Rights Movement, the ending of the Vietnam War, but also recently outside of U.S. borders, mostly, sadly. But let's just say, basically what they did recently, like a few years ago in South Korea, they had a president people found illegitimate, and it started by weekly protests every single week persistently, mass numbers, a general strike to basically drive out their corrupt regime. They did the same in Armenia. They did the same with Like Puerto Rico recently is the most recent, the greatest example, in my opinion, of how they drove out that governor. They didn't vote that governor out. The people went on the street and demanded he stayed. We could do that here. And then when the issue in Hong Kong, people were on the street, and I think they're still on the street persistently. So it's and successful results has happened with pretty much mass movement, general strike protests. And guess what? The civil rights movement, that did not get voted in. When Nixon got out of office, guess what? We want to drive out both Mike Pence and Donald Trump. And give you some of younger folks a history lesson. I mean, that's before my time too. But guess what? We drove out Spiro Agnew, his vice president. Then we drove out Richard Nixon. We could, and that he didn't get voted out. He got driven out. I think Nixon wanted to cling to power, in my personal opinion. And that's the fear we have with Trump and Pence is, let's just say 2020 comes, you go vote, and let's say he does lose, right? Okay, like Lou said, spoke to the two questions. He's not going to let go. His lawyer, Michael Cohen, warned us this dude is not going to go. And at the same time, let's just say if he does lose the majority vote, and the Electoral College turns on us again and chooses Trump against the people's will, what are we going to do then? Sit there and take it? And at the same time, why wait till then? Well, let's start the movement now. So.
For Vietnam, the people protesting convinced LBJ, Lyndon B. Johnson to get out of Vietnam. I think, right? Is that the?
It was actually Nixon that got the troops out of Vietnam, but
Okay.
but it's not because he really wanted that. It's because the people lit a fire under his behind. Basically, it was massive movements. I mean, obviously it was before I wasn't born yet. Maybe Luke could speak more to that. I don't know, but it was the pressure you got from the people.
No, and I'm glad you raised Lyndon Baines Johnson because he didn't run in '68 because of such massive resistance and upheaval that was going on against the war in Vietnam, but also joining with the black liberation struggle, and in that raising society, including the beginning struggles against the oppression of women, and that went on. I was involved then, and I was involved in very powerful actions and protests on campuses, but also right before Nixon resigned, I was involved in the military and part of a GI rebellion, where it became more and more difficult as many young people who went in believing in America began to see the ugly, ugly truth of what the U.S. was doing in Vietnam, the lie about what that war is about, and the reality of the massive bloodshed, up to 3 million people killed there. There was real upheaval and resistance, and people refusing to take it, and that's what led to the resignation of Richard Nixon.
What was the turning point in ending America's involvement in Vietnam, and how could that be applied to getting Pence and Trump out of the White House?
Well, that's a good question, and I think one of the things that happened during the '60s and early '70s was people, and this again I was referring to active duty soldiers, and then many of them came back like myself to protest and expose what we saw and what we knew. But we refused to believe that the Vietnamese people were gooks, that they were inferior, that they were there, and that we should accept carrying out genocide. And that's not an exaggeration, genocide, not when there's 3 million people killed in Indochina. And then people found the conscience to act, and not just to act to wait for a new presidential election. They said, we cannot wait while this bloodshed is going on. And people rose their head, and they rose their bodies in the streets. They got out of their comfort zones. They came into the streets, and they persisted. We've had millions in the streets in the last 3 years, millions. But what's been missing is people going in the streets and staying and presenting a demand, very clear, unified demand, non-negotiable. This Trump-Pence regime, which represents a catastrophe, an existential threat to humanity, must go in the interest of all humanity.
In Vietnam, were the protesters able to convince legislators to help them? And are you able to convince legislators now to help your cause, refuse fascism? And will those legislators be enough to help drive Pence and Trump out of the White House? Is that what you aim to do? To protest and then convince the legislature to help you?
In short, like with Puerto Rico or South Korea, which successfully drove its president out, President Park in 2016, 2017, where she was indicted, convicted, and sent to jail. It was people staying in the streets and creating a crisis, the one kind of crisis that Trump hasn't had, where millions of people in growing numbers are refusing to go along with it. Then the exposure and the atrocities come out to more and more people. People find their courage and their conviction. And that creates a situation within the government that every part of those in power have to respond to this demand before the world of Trump and Pence must go. It's illegitimate, it's fascist, it's a threat to humanity. The mechanism that happens, again, it happened in 74 with Nixon resigning. It happened the way it did in
Well,
48.
when Nixon resigned, did that help the Vietnam War cause? Is that why it's important that Nixon resigned?
It was an important part of ending the war in Vietnam that he was driven out of power.
I see.
And,
No, why don't you go to finish?
well, I just wanted to say,
Sorry.
one of the questions people have, well, what comes after? The thing is, if we're talking about the environmental disaster, which people ourselves will be marching around the climate strike on Friday, or these other horrors, the difference is this: if millions of people wake up, find their courage, shake off the complacency, come into the streets and get out of their couches, and you have a movement that's based on an ethos of respecting all humanity. Americans are not more important than other people around the world. Respect for the diversity of life, of different nationalities, of women, LGBTQ. Then you've got a whole different, a very, very different situation to go forward on and continue to fight to end all the nightmares that people are facing. But if we don't, the alternative is, if this regime locks into place this, we aren't going to be protesting. People, what happened at Northeastern University at NEIU last week, where people came out and called out this fascist collaborator, Trump, Sean Spicer, those kind of things will be increasingly squelched and suppressed. Not to mention what happens to the press and people's ability to think, science, all that. You won't even know about climate change after.
And he already actually passed an executive order to pretty much put free speech into universities, to let conservative speech happen in universities, and that in itself basically is an attack on critical thinking. And you mentioned something about legislatures. I'm scared to rely on anybody in the legislature, especially in the Democratic Party. The reason I'm scared to is Nancy Pelosi will not go for impeachment. She will let. It looks to me like she will let fascism consolidate. The Democratic Party is not doing much to help. Bernie Sanders is said now's not a good time to go for impeachment, and that frightens me. You got some of the legislators like Jan Schakowsky, who's kind of going for it, and others are going for it, but the main leadership are not going for it. It's up to us. I'm scared to leave it to legislatures. I'd rather scream in their ears and demand they do it. Because if we leave it, if I sit back at home and let the Democratic Party handle this, I'm scared for my future. I'm scared for the future of anybody that I'm friends with that has kids. You know, and some of those kids, I'm scared for their future. You know, like.
For the civil rights movement, people were protesting, and then the Civil Rights Act got enacted. And that helped a lot. That's why I was asking about legislators. For Nixon, getting out of the Vietnam War, he left. He had to leave office because he might have gotten impeached for Watergate.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But that really did not help the Vietnam War that much. However, right now, for Pence and Trump, if there is an investigation of wrongdoing on their part and they are indicted, and then of course that's the way that they would be removed from office. Do you see any investigations going on of them that you are aware of?
Well, in short, I think there's many, many crimes that Trump and Pence have carried out, including obstruction of justice. And if there was a situation where people felt compelled to move on him, whether through impeachment or other things, but the Democratic Party has shown pretty stubbornly that's not where they're going. Unfortunately, they feel more commitment. It's more important for them to preserve the order of this system and this empire, even though they're being attacked, some very viciously. Go home, remember? Ugly, racist stuff. A mayor of, talking about Baltimore as vermin filled because he's attacking, the mayor and people there. They are in a position, they are being attacked, but they are not calling for never do you see them calling for the kind of real resistance, like in Puerto Rico or South Korea, that would actually create conditions where this regime could be removed from power.
So the Democrats want to preserve the status quo, is what you're saying, so that they are not moving to remove Pence and Nixon from the White House?
They're afraid. They're afraid of Trump and Pence. They're afraid of his followers. And they're also afraid of us. They're afraid of people going into the streets, many of them who've looked to them, sometimes for their whole lives, for justice or for some change, that those people, that they are refusing to act on the demands that people have had to fight this and change this, going out in the streets, they're afraid of that too, of where it will go.
What are they afraid of? If people do go out in the street, how is the status quo going to change, and how will it affect them? Will it affect their re-election chances? Is it that you're saying that they have things that they need to be afraid of too, that they need to preserve the status quo?
Well, I mean, if I can answer, well, the best way I can answer is if let's say if there is a mass movement, hopefully there will be, that like in Puerto Rico recently, if there is a mass movement, then eventually that will force the Democratic Party to act. That will force them to think, oh crap, re-election, and then we got to calm these people down somehow. That will cause them to act, and because even if, like, just say a mass movement starts in, let's just say, not even rural towns, but let's just say 4 or 5 major cities, like in, let's say, Chicago, Philly, New York, LA, Houston, that's going to cause a huge effect, and that's going to reevaluate the Democratic Party's thinking. That's why it's very critical for us to be active, because right now, without us being active, we're seeing things happen that's making us sick to the stomach. Because honestly, when you hear the details of the concentration camps of kids eating cold TV dinners, women basically drinking out of toilets, or let's just say if they have their periods, that basically they have to walk around with blood because they don't have the right, sanitation for that. If that doesn't make you sick in the stomach, you're okay moving on with your life knowing this has happened. Even if you believe in reforming the system, that doesn't eat at you as a decent human being. The Muslim ban, that makes you comfortable that we're banning people of a certain faith from not coming into this country. They actually normalize that. Doesn't that? Because the thing is just like, let's just say even if you don't comprehend the whole what fascism is in itself. After Trump and Pence got elected, I'll make it really simple. After Trump and Pence got elected, do you not feel that something's really just not right? Something's really off here? We're evolving in a place where you're not feeling comfortable.
Do you have any allies in the government working with you and supporting Refuse Fascism?
Here's the cold truth. Millions of people right now who feel much the same way we do in many respects, that cry when they hear the children scream being separated from their parents, who wake up night in a cold sweat thinking about the environmental devastation where it's going. But they are waiting, and largely what they're waiting for is the Democratic Party and the normal political processes to work. And that is what's taking people away from the kind of life-saving action that is being required from us. So there are not people, I can't speak about how every official thinks, but they are not moving. The most important thing here is they are not only not moving in a serious way to stop these crimes, again, whether it's on the border or the whole consolidation of fascist regime, they're conciliating with it, and they're leading people away from confronting the reality and finding their conscience and going out in the street. Look, this has been going on for almost 3 years now. It's not complicated that we are facing fascism, nor it's not mysterious what we have to do. It's hard. No one here is going to say it's not very hard, it's risk-free to go out in the street and sustain protest, but it's needed.
This is WZRD Chicago 88.3 FM. We have with us at Wizard, Lou, David, and Emily from Refuse Fascism. My next question is there anybody in Refuse Fascism or in organizations that you are working with running for political office so that you can also make a change politically as well as on the street with protests?
The kind of organization Refuse Fascism is, like I said, we're pretty much a group that do have different political beliefs in a general sense, but we're united to recognize that Trump impending fascist. But we don't back any candidates, and just because we
No, that wasn't my question. I'm asking
sorry.
if anybody in Refuse Fascism or in any of the organizations that you're working with are actually running for office, are planning to run for office and take this cause up and building the support behind them,
Oh.
behind them from you.
Okay, nobody Refuse Fascism is running for office, and if they were, I mean, like,
You know, I think, I don't know that no one is not. In other words,
not that I'm not aware of.
I'm just saying,
Yeah.
there's people that are involved in more than one project, including people that are involved in organizing, voting, and perhaps even running for for offices. But what unites us together we're nonpartisan, which means you don't get involved in that level of things. But what unites people in Refuse Fascism and where we come together is building, organizing, mass sustained protests to go and stay in the streets to drive them out.
Have you contacted any of Chicago's alderpersons and Mayor Lightfoot? Are you working with any city officials? Yes, please continue.
So I was just simply saying, we've had protests, and I was giving the example after the murder of Heather Hoyer in Charlottesville in 2017, where there were political figures, including a congressperson, that joined us on stage. Again, the demand on that stage overall was people coming together to call out, in that case, the atrocity of white supremacist terror that was going on. So we're not, people are involved in different kinds of projects, and including people that are, doing really, doing things that are, to try to help, in various ways, some of what immigrants are facing. But here's the bottom line, or, to provide abortion. We cannot focus on saving people one at a time. It's much bigger than that. And that's what we're confronted with, having to have a solution that could actually stop this whole thing from continuing to just tear people's lives apart, and at the same time consolidate so more of that will become more and more. There's a reason why people look at The Handmaid's Tale, the Margaret Atwood novel, as something that's eerily real in terms of how it treats women, and now in further installments how it asserts white supremacy.
Do you see anything in the framework of past organization, like, for instance, in Vietnam, getting the troops out of Vietnam and in the civil rights movement, were there people that actually were in a position to organize all different aspects of the protests so that the protests are more effective? And if there were such in the history, are you able to use that same process now for Refuse Fascism?
Well, just one thing I would highlight is that there's many, many different ways that people can act around this central demand of Trump and Pence must go. We need lawyers. We need medical people.
Do you have lawyers? Do you have medical
We have
people?
united with lawyers, yes, who have stood with us in protest.
Do you work with the ACLU?
We collaborate with them. They're not. That's not their mission statement to drive out the Trump-Pence regime to sustain that struggle. But there's also a lot of different things people can do, from spreading the word on their social media to raising funds. That makes a big difference of whether this message, which is to get out there to society, including the millions of people that feel it but don't even know about Refuse Fascism. So there's lots of ways in people's lives that they can be part of building the momentum and building up the organization of Refuse Fascism that's urgently needed, including a lot of creative things from the world of art or others, and students that I haven't mentioned but are important to bring that creativity to bear around this great cause, this most greatest cause right now for anything you're fighting for that's important, whether it's for immigrants or for to stop the environmental disaster, we are confronted with a hardening fascist regime that's got to be stopped.
Organizing takes a lot of time and a lot of money. Are you able to just volunteer, or are you getting paid?
This is a volunteer organization.
How did what in your background, in all of your backgrounds, prepared you to work with Refuse Fascism? Emily, you go first. You
Okay.
have
Nothing in my background really prepared me to work with Refuse Fascism. It was more of something that I personally felt passionate about. I mean, I do for a living. I do work with children, so I do want a better future for them. So I mean, that was a big part of why I got involved initially. But
because of what was happening to the immigrant children being torn from their parents, is that what convinced you to join?
that was a big part of it, yes. But I mean, other than that passion that I also have for working with children, there's nothing really specific in my background that is necessarily beneficial to what we're doing as Refuse Fascism. It's just something that I feel passionate about, something that I wanted to be involved in, wanted to be a part of.
Yeah, I was never really I mean, I'd always have general strong political opinions, and back in my earlier days, I did used to vote, but but looking like, how do I say this? I was never politically active, but then when Trump was running for office, it was very eerie for me. Eerie in a sense where, like, I had grandparents on both sides of my family. My family's from Poland, and I have grandparents on both sides of that family that did suffer in World War II. My dad's side of the family lived in a rural village in Moyniak, and I guess there was some levels of Nazi oppression there, where people would get randomly killed and stuff like that. So I'm aware of those stories. Then I also am aware of my grandmother's stories on my mother's side. She wasn't a person that color coded things, especially to a kid. So there's some graphic stories, and some I share with people, some I actually don't share with people for personal reasons. But eventually, even though I knew my grandfather, he didn't share too many of those stories, ironically. But he fought in the Spanish Civil War against Franco, and he joined the National Brigades, and so he saw the rise of fascism, and some people even told him he might be overreacting a little bit on Hitler. But he went over there and fought it, and then eventually he went to fight the Nazis later on. He was even later on captured by the Nazis. But like the stories my grandmother told me, and of course, like my grandmother wasn't as well read like as a Jason Stanley, who wrote How Fascism Works, is well read, or anybody else who analyzed fascism. She wasn't that well versed in a doctoral sense, but she knew what led to fascism. She knew it was people being inactive, and she knew about I was brought up on that. So when I saw Trump running for office, I basically saw that happening. And then when he won, I was stunned. But then eventually I heard reassurances from media, either mainstream media or even like progressive left media, like Young Turks, saying, "Oh no, Trump's going to be out of office in 10 months. He'll be out of office. He won't last a full year." And I'm ashamed to say I actually ate that up a little bit. But when I saw that being very bleak, by accident, I did come across Refuse Fascism on TV online, and I figured, I'm going to pop in for a meeting and see what these guys are about. Because at least from what I saw prior to me going to the meeting, they were on point on what fascism was.
Do you still find a lot of people who do not understand fascism as well as you do? Because it seems as if generationally you've learned a lot that gives you more insight into fascism than the regular person on the street.
There's two versions of that. And I'm not saying I have some superior intellect of fascism. I really don't. I was lucky enough to be schooled in that as a kid, and also do some research on my own as I got older. But there's two things to that. I do criticize the American education system for not really teaching people what fascism is. If the education school system could pass out How Fascism Works by Jason Stanley, or screen the Trump Pence Must Go film by Bob Avakian, like if every school could do that, that'd be wonderful actually. But our American school systems don't teach what fascism is, what fascist consolidation is, and where fascism starts and comes from. Our schools don't analyze that, so I do partially blame the school system. And then there are some people out there who know what this is. but they feel it's too big to defeat, or maybe I'll stay quiet and will go past, like like people in Germany did before World War II started when Hitler was already in power. So you get two denominations both, where they think it's too big to defeat, or some people think that way and just basically just want to just move on and just kind of put a blind eye to it. So you come across that too, and I'm not out there to shame those people because I know how intimidating that can get, but at the same time, it's I kind of challenge them. Can you swallow that? And let's say there's some people that our school system never taught that to. So
Well, then, do you have
Emily
any?
just said she's one of them. Emily just said she's one of them. So yeah.
Yes. Well, do you have any educators then that are working with you, and perhaps they could help you to rally people as well, because they could shed light to the fact that school children are not learning what they need to learn.
I know Emily's an educator.
yeah.
Outside of Emily, also, we've had educators march with us, and they've all come to our meetings. I know we were recently invited by an educator to speak in his class, but at the same time, we don't have enough educators, and either whether it's teaching fascism in schools or having us speak in their classes, or just even joining us actually. In the movement, we could use educators. We could also use artists as well in the movement. So we welcome all to bring your input, and
So I guess for the civil rights movement and the Vietnam War protests, they had a lot of educators working with them. Didn't they?
Yeah, they did. I mean, a lot of those protests, happened in college campuses. So, and even like when I was in college during the second Iraq War, I was in college when we invaded Afghanistan and Iraq. And I remember I'm not in college currently, but like when I was in college, I remember there were students protesting that, but now I kind of see the opposite, which kind of hurts my heart a little bit. Unless you want to add something to that, Emily. I don't know.
I mean, my educational, what I'm able to do is birth through first grade, and I feel like to a larger extent fascism is much too heavy for a first grader to be learning about. So that's not something I personally could be teaching children, but I certainly think that educators can, especially as kids get into junior high and high school, especially they can be out here teaching kids, even just the basics of fascism, different characteristics that fascism has, things like that. I mean, I didn't learn what, like David had said, I didn't learn what fascism was until I was in college. And I've been out of college for about 2 years now. But, that's a problem, that I didn't learn what fascism was till I was, 20 or 21 years old.
Do you have a lot of protests and rallies on college campuses, and how well are they attended? If you do have them.
Can I just circle back for 1 second?
Yes,
You're
absolutely.
raising an important point about teachers, intellectuals, and others. And they are urgently needed. And there's many of them, maybe unprecedented numbers, have gone out in the streets in various protests. Think about scientists. That's one thing that's even much sharper than when I first got involved in protests in the 60s and 70s, is science itself is being slammed. People that have dedicated their life to research are being gagged. Think about this, scientists have to take their findings and try to hide it on a hard drive in Canada, because this regime is literally not just gagging them, but trying to stop this. So it's
what are the consequences if they present their research? Are they blacklisted?
That's a good question, which I don't know all that. I mean, I know even something that seems just ridiculous, like what happened when Trump decided that Hurricane Dorian was headed toward Alabama, and changed the weather map. And when people just basically said that was a mistake in NOAA, they got pushback and threatened from the president. You don't disagree with the president, even if it's around something as basic as where is a hurricane hitting?
What kind of pushback? I know that I heard about the pushback. Were people being threatened, and with firing if they went ahead and presented something contrary to the president.
I mean, I don't have the, I mean, hopefully someone in your audience probably knows that, the actual details of the, you know, there's people being forced out of the EPA, we know that. They've been forced out or just forced to retire or quit because they can't do their work, what they used to do on the Environmental Protection Agency. And I think that applies. I mean, there's a certain house cleaning going on. That's another aspect of fascism consolidating, is taking institutions, whether it's the courts, or whether it's ones like the Environmental Protection Agency, or the Department of the Interior, and both turning them into, I mean, think about Department of Education, and what you know, run by the DeVos, Betsy DeVos, who has been committed to basically tearing down public education, and in many cases replacing with a Mike Pence-style Christian fascist education. So we do know there's been people that have been forced out and left, and then people that tried to protest and have suffered some consequences. I don't have all the details, but I'm glad you asked, and we should accumulate that.
Well, okay, go ahead.
Well, I just want to make sure at some point because we're talking about the urgency of people acting, and there's a couple of very important ways that are coming up, and we want to make sure that people are invited to be part of that.
Absolutely. Well, I did ask whether you have a lot of rallies going on college
Yeah.
campuses, and whether they are well attended if you do have rallies on college campuses.
And we recognize for all the students listening that this movement for sustained nonviolent protest that has the strength to stand up against this regime needs students and campuses. And so we haven't, you know, we go out to campuses, and there's been rallies and other campuses. There's been two, listen to this, there are some members of Refuse Fascism on UCLA campus, you know, University of California, Los Angeles, that stood up and called out Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin. This was some time ago, right? And when they brought him to campus, kind of like when they brought Sean Spicer to this campus, and they stood up and called it out, what he represented, what it meant being on UCLA. They were physically picked up, one on the back or on the shoulder of a big old cop, and taken out, and are still facing charges for that. So you know, there is the fear factor. People, and that's, again, there was some important bravery here last week when people came out to protest Sean Spicer, and it would have been even, and including some that did go inside and called out the liar for what he was. But so we really want help around speaking to students and getting out to students and finding a way to know more about what they're thinking and what's holding them back. Because listen, whatever you're studying, is it biology, is it environmental science, is it medicine, is it philosophy? To put it real bluntly, what you're trying to do in your studies and dedicate your life to doesn't mean very much at all. If we don't stop this regime from consolidating, what you're going to be studying, what you're going to be working for in all those fields is what, you know, is what will serve this economy, this regime, and this fascism. So I think it's really important that we want to invite to all the events we're doing, including the meeting we're having tonight, to invite students and others, which is at 1212 West Bryn Mawr, Edgewater Presbyterian Church. We're going to be making plans for September, September 21st and September 22nd.
Well, let me ask you another question before we go into the details for those two events. How strong is the student presence in Refuse Fascism?
Not strong enough. Maybe they can speak to it. But
You wanna go or should I?
You can, I don't.
There are some students, but not as massive as it should be. I mean, my personal wish and fantasy would be like every university, whether it's NEIU over here or Loyola more north or wherever, to pretty much have Refuse Fascism chapters, you know. I know there have been people, not myself because I work during the day, but there have been people who've been active on campuses, but it's, I think, like Lou said, actually, like if you are studying environmental science and the sciences to whatever, like this Trump Pence regime is a threat to you, you know. So I think it'd be very critical for like students to be more active, and we're definitely not discouraging it. So
Right.
hence
I mean-
one of the reasons we're here at ZRD, even, you know.
Right,
So
and a special challenge and invitation to Northeastern Illinois University students. I was there at the protest last week, as both of my
All of us
friends
were,
here
yeah.
were.
Yeah.
And you know, you heard students, including one young woman who got up and talked about what it's meant to her to be an immigrant. She said, "I'm undocumented, I'm unafraid, I'm unapologetic." And you're bringing this person that was part of fanning the flames of white supremacy and anti-immigrant terror on campus and legitimizing them? Outrage. And she was absolutely right. It's also the case that you cannot have a hate-free zone on a campus or anywhere else in a country that is being ruled by people and working to consolidate a fascist regime and unleashing white supremacy. There is no safe space on campuses or in a church or whatever. What we have to do in the churches, look, I got to give it up for the Never Again people. You know, the particularly Jewish people who organized some powerful protests around the slogan of "Never Again means now," referring back to what their families and ancestors learned in Nazi Germany. But we have to come from the temples and the churches and the mosques, and we have to come from the campuses and the workplaces and the fields of science and throughout society, and people in the ghettos and barrios and people in the universities. But that
Do you have enough people going out into these various groups to recruit them to join you in
No,
Refuse Fascism?
we're recruiting people to help us do that. I'm glad you raised that, because look, it is up to people out there listening to this and who are reaching out to it really in increasing ways in the next few weeks. If not now, when? If not us, who?
For the group Never Again, are you working with them? Are they working with you?
There's people in our chapter and around the country that have been active and involved in civil disobedience with them.
Okay. What is the in Refuse Fascism? Is there any group that is the majority of who you are, so that we can see in what part of the community your members are the strongest and how you could build on that? Or is it very, there's no concentration, it's people from all walks of life? It's, you know.
yeah, I mean, like, and I know we're on the north side, where some of us can be on the west side, some of us live out in the suburbs, but there's no bound limit. We're stuck this. I mean, you can't drive out a massive fascist out of a White House if you're stuck in one neighborhood, or you're building a movement inside of a university, and that's it. You know, no. You need to branch out to every neighborhood in Chicago, and I know hopefully we'll be going to every neighborhood in Chicago, beyond Chicago, and hopefully I'm sure that's true for all chapters in every city in the United States too, since we are a national organization. So.
Well, I think that what I was getting at, is there any commonality among the members of Refuse Fascism that, besides wanting to refuse fascism, is there anything in their backgrounds that are like the common thread in your group?
The most basic way I can answer that is we all don't believe that fascism should consolidate, and we also believe that voting by itself will not stop its consolidation. And like Lou said, some of us are radicals, and some of us are also heavily involved in electoral politics. But we all stand united in saying we need to do more than vote. To go beyond voting, drive out this fascist regime. That is the core common thread of Refuse Fascism.
I mean, I think that is, it's people that have made the decision that they are not going to turn their heads away from what's happening, whether at the border or what's happening to the environment, and whether it is some older people like myself that got lessons out of the upheaval in the 60s and 70s, whether it's one of our members that, speaking of campuses, was arrested at the University of Chicago and faced felony charges for a Refuse Fascism Day of Action of 11 minutes of silence for 11 million undocumented immigrants. And for the 11 minutes of silence, she was dragged out of the University of Chicago dining hall, the Hutch, and then charged with heavy felonies, and people rallied together to defend her, but she's still banned from University of Chicago. That's we have people on trial, heavy trials right now in LA, the Freeway 9, go to #Freeway9, people that boldly did what we should have done more back then and need to do now, went and shut down Highway 101. with a big sign that said, Trump and Pence must go, it's time to begin. And it's been very powerful, people coming together. But even in the revelations, people should check this in L.A. Spying, sending informants. This all came out. Sending informants to spy illegally, unconstitutionally on their meetings. They're still facing trial. It's very important to beat that back. And it's an example of the kind of action that's needed, where people find their conscience. So I'm going back. That's kind of the thread that pulls people together.
You mean Refuse Fascism is going into other meetings just to see what the other side is doing? Is that what you mean?
What they call this, actually in L.A., it's even called the Terrorist Task Force. They sent spies into Refuse Fascism chapter meetings, and this got revealed when they went to trial around the very bold, powerful action on the Highway 101 through Los Angeles. Yeah, I'm glad you clarified that.
What about that young woman that was arrested at
University of Chicago?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. What was she doing differently from the other people in that 11-minute silence, or it was everybody was the same and she just got selected to be arrested?
From what I understand, she just got selected. She wasn't doing anything out of the ordinary. It was a silent protest. It's one thing the person was screaming, but this was a silent protest. And she, from my understanding, she got tackled. And the funny thing is she got checked for bruises and was facing a felony. Yet the cops that tackled her, which from my understanding were kind of my size, I'm like 6'4", like none of they were quote unquote assaulted. And I'm saying quote unquote because she got checked for bruises, they didn't. Now, if somebody beats me up, I'm assuming I'll check. I'll get the medical attention. But that's kind of the weird irony of that. But
And people can find out more at #FreeMaya. Her name's Maya Cruz. She's a member of the Revolution Club and Refuse Fascism.
How do you spell Maya? M-Y-A or M-I-A?
M-A-Y-A. #free M-A-Y-A. Free Maya.
I see.
Or you can go to the Chicago Revolution Club Facebook page also to find out more.
Chicago Revolution Club, is that a student organization?
No, it's a no.
Okay,
But they do work on campuses, including around Refuse Fascism.
I see. And what about Maya? Did she was she in the press, maybe in the college newspaper, protesting about it? Is that maybe why she? Or do you know if that was why she was selected to be arrested, because there was something in her past that she did stand up for, and it got reported?
that's something you have to ask the cops that arrested her. Why she was selected, I do not know.
I mean, there is, again, both in Chicago, where people from the Revolution Club have been targeted,
Yes.
and certainly in Los Angeles, where people in the Revolution Club and Refuse Fascism have been targeted, where some of the evidence of what's going on behind the scenes, how they're being targeted, certainly in Los Angeles has come out.
Yeah.
And we're working on that in Chicago too, because it's really important to look at people. Where are you going to stand when dissent is being criminalized? That's exactly one of the key moving parts of fascism. Is moving more and more, whether it's environmental activists facing heavy charges, or activists, or reporters trying to bring the story of the concentration camps and getting put on lists. That is exactly the question. Don't think. You want to wait? You want to wait further in the future to stand up against this regime? I think it's going to be much, much more difficult, where the penalties will be greater. Well, the ability to get truth out will be harder. Now is the time.
Do you have anybody that lost their jobs, such as in the EPA, that or in other walks of life, that got fired because they do not go along with Pence and Trump? And are they working with you? Because they have skin in the game.
Not to my knowledge. Obviously, I cannot speak for other chapters in different cities, but in Chicago, no, nobody like that's attached to the chapter in Chicago that I know of.
I mean, I
can't
guess
speak for other cities.
Perhaps to give you a picture of this, Refuse Fascism and its basic demand, Trump and Pence must go. Its poster, in the name of humanity, no, in the name of humanity, we refuse to accept a fascist America. In its protests and its presence has been seen and reached hundreds of thousands of people. The issue is building, in other words, people making the decision. Not, in other words, why it is that there's all kinds of important protests that are righteous. A lot of righteous protests and activities that are going on, not near enough, especially anymore. There's a certain paralysis. But part of the bridge we've got to cross, and that's why we look so much, to learn from people in Puerto Rico and Hong Kong and Sudan and Algeria and South Korea, is because they did something that has not yet been done in this country, not in this era, which is go into the streets and stay in the streets, bringing forward the most courage of people, even if they're very afraid, and bringing together a community of a lot of resistance and joy, but around the demand that is most impactful in terms of what humanity is facing, not just in this country, because this regime, remember, this lunatic has got his finger on the nuclear trigger. This biggest polluter and military force in the world is escalating climate change. So that's our call for everyone, including people that we've been in the streets with thousands of people. And many people honestly have kind of backed off. And
Why do they back off?
I think, well, there's a number of reasons, but one is there's a certain compact that some people make that I hate this and I don't like it, but if it doesn't hit me and my family, I'm going to try to wait it out. And there's examples in history of people that have tried to wait out horrors and found themselves consumed by something much worse than that. But there also is examples in history where people stood up against the odds and changed the course of history. So there's, I think, to answer your question, there's that.
Like home.
Well, even what they did in South Korea, what they did in Puerto Rico, that was by no means, it's one of those things where people would have said, that's not going to happen. People had suffered through Hurricane Maria, the insult of a fascist president throwing paper towels at them and repeatedly insulting and denying that people were dying, and a local administration was going along with that. Really, thousands died, and many suffered and are still suffering. And yet, a couple years later, partly provoked by the truth coming around President Rosello's chats, just how vicious and ugly and illegitimate it was, the dam broke. People said, enough. And they started to go out in the streets, not in huge numbers at first. The first ones were small protests, but it struck a nerve, and then see, that's the thing. People don't know what they can do, or even their deepest feelings, until you start to present this to them, that there's a way out, and catalyze that, and create something that becomes an alternative, something, that waiting is not only immoral, it's not necessary.
Do you find that people do not join because they really don't understand the reality of what you are saying?
That's not really. I mean, that's it's not a straight. I mean, like that's not a straight line because it kind of pertains to that person specifically. Let's say if he joins, or let's just say if he just can't work with that, he or she cannot refuse fascism. It's more the sense of it could be multiple reasons. It could be this is too overwhelming, doesn't look defeatable, and I've come across that.
But I think the answer is yes. People don't understand. That's part of the reason.
That's part of the term.
We were with hundreds of people, young women students, for instance, probably from here, in June, after the abortion bans in Alabama and Mississippi, and were spreading, right? And people saw where it was headed with a growing fascist Supreme Court. And they went out in the streets with boldness and courage. But the question is, and this gets to your point of what do they understand, this is part of even that, what happened 2 weeks ago when Planned Parenthood, essentially, and others that can even mention the word abortion, give basic doctor medical advice. What happened when the funding was cut off? Do you remember what happened? I don't either, because very little did happen, including from the Women's March and stuff. So there's a way people, despite their best intentions, they begin to feel powerless and get used to it. And that's why both the single demand of Trump-Pence must go, but this strategy of sustained, not one day. The Women's March was powerful, but it was one day. But sustained resistance, it needs to be put on the map, and that's what we're working on.
And also, the one trap I really discourage people from falling into is, let's just say, I know people that are very emotional about Central American migrants in cages and stuff like that without trial, with children being mistreated and women being mistreated, and they stick to that issue. They don't think any beyond it. Or let's just say you get the fight for abortion rights, the attack on women's rights.